Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be before this august audience, watching us from all over the diaspora, members of the diaspora, the ladies and gentlemen, working very hard and also keeping an eye constantly on things that are going on back home. My name is David Mpanga. I am the Minister for Special Duties in the Kingdom of Uganda. And one of the areas in which I'm focused and on which I have responsibility is the area of federalism. Federalism is a key demand of the kingdom, a key interest of the kingdom, especially since restoration in 1993. It is an often used word, a term which we use and have even made a Uganda word, federal. But sometimes we don't analyze it as much as we should, and sometimes it leads us to have problems in meeting expectations and understanding what it is that we're looking for. If I may give you a quick and rough and ready definition of federalism, federalism is an arrangement, a legally premised arrangement under which nations share power with a supranational entity. Federalism essentially is never neat and symmetrical. It is two or more nations getting together and agreeing to place above them a superstructure, which is sometimes called the federal government, sometimes called a central government, which superstructure will manage certain aspects that the sovereign nations would have managed for themselves. If you took a simple example, look at a housing estate. Many of you will be familiar with these, or a housing complex. Each unit in that complex or each unit in that estate is a sovereign nation. But the estate or the housing authorities have certain overriding responsibilities which have been handed over by each of these separate units for central management. So if you have a central stairwell, you have rubbish or refuse collection, you have lighting, you have heating, you have gardens in common, all those things that would have been run independently by each unit are now run by a central authority to which each of you contribute money. It might be a tenants association, it might be a housing association or something of that nature. That's what rough and ready federalism is. Sovereign nations giving up some of their sovereign rights in order that they may live together. A political writer has said that federalism exists where nations can't live without each other, but must live with each other in a certain way, under one roof. Federalism is always a unique compromise, so that there are no two federal systems anywhere in the world that work exactly the same. It is always a compromise born out of unique political circumstances. Federalism is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. Simply saying we're now federalism, or we're now a federal state, doesn't in and of itself create anything other than the beginning of a new process under which you'll be working with others, other states, and a supranational federal arrangement. So constantly, federalism, the states' rights and the federal rights, interstate rights are constantly being tested. And federalism, therefore, needs to be understood as a road, a means to get to somewhere, not a destination in and of itself. Federalism is also a label. It's better understood as one would understand the essence of what an elephant is. The blind men, the parable of the blind men who saw an elephant, who came to an elephant, touched and felt it, and each one of them gave it a different definition depending on where they were touching, comes to mind. So federalism is best understood in essence. You can have governments labeled federal, which in fact are not. You can have governments which are not labeled federal, such as the South African government, or systems, better, which is in fact, South Africa is in fact essentially a federal arrangement, but by reason of its history, chooses not to use the word federal. So we understand that it's important to get the essence of federalism. I think it's also important that we understand that federalism is founded in legal precepts, in legal documents. Mostly wherever it exists, it comes out of a written constitution. But federalism is not a legal concept. It's not a legal element. It is essentially political. It is an understanding of how to govern a country and how to divide power between a sovereign nation state and a supranational federal state in order that more than one state may get together and live. Federalism, if I may end the introduction and definition stage on this, is impossible in the absence of constitutionalism and the rule of law. If you don't have a political system that respects constitutionalism and that places the law above all else, above political expedience, federalism will thrive. If you have a situation where the constitution is generally bent to meet the needs of the day or the needs of a particular individual or a particular party, if you have a situation where the delicate balance of power, where armed or other vested interests override law, override the rule of law, you generally tend to find federalism being impossible. It can exist in name, but generally it doesn't thrive in substance. From a historical perspective, Uganda was a federal nation at independence because Uganda is a colonial state, is a colonial construct. It was made up of several sovereign nations, native African sovereign nations, that were brought together in one geographical territory, which the British chose to call Uganda, bastardizing the name of Buganda Kingdom, and chose to run essentially from the geographical center, which is in Buganda.
Nze nga kabaka afuga Obuganda, buli mulabe wange ndi muwangula.
Buganda had a system with a kabaka, Ruchiko, abataka, abalangira, bakabona, a sovereign system that was essentially defended with clear demarcation of boundaries, which used to change as we expanded or contracted, depending on power balance at the time. But since the 19th century, we've been under a situation of British and global Western imperialist rule, if I may put it that way. And on that basis, we've had to work in Uganda. Uganda, as a British imposition, did not destroy Buganda or Bunyoro or Nkore or Teso Acholi. It simply froze them in their political development and in their territorial existence as it was at that time, give or take, and then caused them to need to live together. That is why in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s, when there was agitation for independence, some people were saying that sovereignty should be taken back to the place from which it was taken. That is, each sovereign African nation should be restored to the place where the British imperialists found it. Others who chose to call themselves progressive or nationalists, as they were termed, said power should be left with this new colonial construct. But the entities, the compromise that came about from that discussion was that the sovereign entities that had been Buganda, Bunyoro, Toro, Nkore, Busoga, should work on a federal basis. That is, if you remember our definition in the beginning, that they should give up some of their rights to a central authority, to a federal government or a central government, and manage certain aspects for themselves under the 1962 Constitution. That is roughly what it was, until of course we know that in 1966, Obote, feeling constrained by the Constitution, not wishing to adhere to constitutionalism and the rule of law, taking what were essentially political disputes and wishing to settle them militarily overthrew the 1966 Constitution. The overthrow of the 1966 Constitution saw the abolition of the federal arrangement, saw the abolition of kingdoms, saw the centralization of power in one man and one party, and saw, unfortunately, what in Uganda we are yet to banish: the introduction of militarism in the body politic. Militarism essentially looks at adversaries as enemies who need to be killed. It looks at people who might have a different viewpoint as enemies to be crushed, because that's what militaries do. They crush their enemies. They use force to get there, or the threat, or the latent threat of force, to get to impose their will. In politics, it's not a very useful thing because, unfortunately, it is inimical, largely inimical to the rule of law. Democracy, for example, as a popular saying goes, is not two wolves and one lamb voting for what to have for supper. It is a system which is run by the majority but takes cognizance and protects the rights of minorities. So in a situation such as this, where previously sovereign nations, which had been corralled into one state by the colonialists, now found themselves absorbed into what had become a unitary state, what had become a largely authoritarian and autocratic state, the demand for federalism was one of the things that ran, we argue, the liberation struggles, which culminated in the war that took place in Luero, the Luero Triangle of Buganda, led by the Fronasa leadership, but peopled largely by people from this region, from the kingdom, whose primary objective was restoration of the rule of law, in order that there might be a proper restoration of a federal arrangement in which we would have and be able to run certain affairs and certain aspects of our lives in the way that we deem fit, and in the way in which, as the internationally recognized right to self-determination says, manage our political, economic, social affairs, social and cultural affairs without undue external interference. That might include, for example, the restoration of the kingdom, the restoration of traditional offices and the like, and return of expropriated property.
Many people think that the restoration of the Buganda monarchy was, well, it was a marvelous thing. But that was just the beginning, because we now had to almost restart from beginning this very ancient heritage, this very ancient kingdom, which had most of its cultural fundamentals destroyed.
Buganda presently doesn't have a federal arrangement, because despite the restoration of the kingdom, there are certain aspects of the governance in Uganda that have left the matter of federalism unresolved on the table. Our present situation is that we have been advocating for federalism for a while. It's become prone to caricature and misrepresentation as a time-worn slogan. It's been bastardized as meaning feudalism. It has been misrepresented to mean a system which favors, I'll be very frank here, maybe Protestant oligarchs, male patriarchy, that does not consider immigrants, that would not like to see non-Baganda living in Buganda, etc., etc. To all of those things, I would say that we need to take cognizance of the fact that indeed Uganda is centered around Buganda, and Buganda is the melting pot that Uganda perhaps ought to be. We have people from all over the country living in Buganda. We have, as Uganda, membership of the East African Community. We're members of COMESA. We have understandings and issues that relate to our standing in the UN and the African Union. So federalism in Uganda is a complex political question. It's not a legal or legislative drafting question. It's a complex political question, and remains so, and we need to understand it as such. Federalism also, as per the definition that I gave, is not decentralization. So frequently we've been offered solutions or compromises that suggest a decentralized form. Decentralization being the central government giving out some of its powers. We argue, on the other hand, the sovereign power rests with the kingdom, rests with each native community. And it is those native communities that must give up some of their powers to live together at the center. So we rejected the regional tier compromise, for example, because we didn't feel comfortable with the idea of an elected catikiro in a situation where elections are run by the central government. And I don't think there's been a non-controversial election since 1996, actually since the inception of Uganda. We don't want to have the kingdom's land controlled by a central entity. We don't want to be dependent on the central entity for finances. We don't want districts, which are units of the central government, to be the legal founding block of Buganda, because a district then can decide to eject itself or can be encouraged to eject itself from the Buganda kingdom. And of course, there were threats of takeover by the central government and indeed nationalization of cultural sites. But the major issue that we had was, again, still one that lay in politics, a lack of good faith. So what do we do? What's the way forward if you're thinking about how do we achieve federalism? We think that federalism will not be achieved by cheap sloganeering, repeated shouting about the word federal itself. We need to think deeper and differently based on political realities today. We must understand the Buganda federalist agenda to be driven by issues that come from our population, but we must then engage with political parties, civil society, the population, regional and international actors to cause Uganda to move in that direction. There's no silver bullet that will bring the federal system, and any person who comes and says, I will bring you federal on his own, is, to be very honest, not telling you the absolute truth. We must be talking, walking, and essentially acting the federalist agenda. We must talk coherently, consistently, and persuasively so that the population may drive the need for federal. People may see that federalism is the solution to the present problems that Uganda is facing. Our walk must be consistent with our talk. We must do things in a way that makes it clear that we not only ask for federalism, but we act in a way that is consistent with federalism and is consistent with inviting and bringing others on board. We need to build capacity. And that building capacity is what Oweek Katikiro, Charles Peter Maiga, has been doing. Building a de facto federal system which sees us working very closely with the central government in areas of health, areas of agriculture, areas of education, but actually setting up this unit as the fundamental building block, which is yielding power in the other direction, and which owns the legitimacy rather than the other way around. Rather than central government giving us a bit of its power, actually us lending it some of its legitimacy, our legitimacy, in order to achieve uniform goals that are desirable. And indeed, that's a reason why many people now aspire to and look to the Kingdom of Buganda as an example. I mean by that kingdoms like Busoga, Bunyoro, taking in lessons on how we're managing land, etc. Because that actually is building capacity to be able to manage a federal state, a federal system. We must, it must be emphasized, limit the number of confrontations, violent confrontations, physical confrontations. Each time such confrontations happen, we lose. Both sides lose, but Buganda loses more. We lose useful citizens who would have been working in a peaceful and constructive way to achieve the federalism we're looking for, who die and maybe are listed or maybe are forgotten as heroes, whereas in fact what we need is a live, happy, healthy population working towards federalism. Very lastly, we need to do more research, designing a new political communication and engagement strategy. We need to be taking in more people. We need to be recruiting more regions. We need to be a beacon, not only for Uganda in other communities, but for Africa. This problem we're talking about here wasn't just created in Africa. It's in many countries. And we need to confront issues of building a new national, regional, and international alliance to achieve federalism. The alliances that we built that helped us with the restoration of the kingdom may no longer be the alliances that will help us get the next mile. we must find ways of getting things done in the new century and in a new way, speaking a new language to the new population, not looking in the past but looking to the future, and being a prospective and useful, proactive tool for the Ugandan, for the Muganda of the 21st century. Lastly, we must build internal political awareness in all of our kingdom entities, because wherever we are as kingdom officials, kingdom employees, wherever you are as a Muganda, you are the ambassador for federalism. You are the person who makes other people feel that federalism, understand and feel that federalism is a solution. So with all of that said as quickly as I could, what do we understand? We understand that federalism is a tool, not an end in itself. It's not a destination. It's a means to an end. It's a means to an end that enables a political, complex, unique political solutions to be handled between what would have been sovereign states working together, giving up some of their power in order to work together and live under the Constitution, rule of law, which determines the rights of states, the rights of the federal entity. We need constitutionalism and the rule of law in order to achieve federalism. We need to address federalism as a political rather than as a legislative or legal drafting issue. We need to persuade others to join us in this struggle, and we need each one of us to be an ambassador wherever we are, in whatever we do, for the value of federalism as a system of governance for our country. And with those words, I wish to bid you all farewell. Awangalai Sawasajakabaka.